Hello, and welcome to our next video on fibers and climate action. Today we dive into two big questions. How can I make my wardrobe sustainable, and does wool have a place in it? The first question getting this video is not new. If you look it up online, thousands of websites will offer you variations of the same answer. You can ask ChatGPT for a nice summary that amalgamates the various conclusions bloggers, journalists, and the greater internet mind have reached. You will likely get some version of the following list: organic cotton, hemp, lyocell, sometimes bamboo and wool, linen, and recycled polyester. Do a little more digging and you will find ample contradictions in this list. People arguing for the inclusion or exclusion of one or the other fiber. I would like to give you a better reasoning for understanding the sustainability of textiles, a rationale that goes beyond simple ranking. So, before delving into the complex world of textiles, I will give you the bottom line that absolutely everyone concerned with our environmental and human health agrees on. The single most impactful thing is to limit the amount of clothing we buy new from virgin sources, wear what we have longer, and wash our clothes less often. These steps dwarf the impact of buying an organic linen shirt rather than a 100% polyester shirt. All right. That being said, choosing a more sustainable, more durable piece of clothing when you do buy will signal a shift in demand to the market and contribute to the process of shifting production to cleaner textiles. It is a first step toward changing norms that needlessly waste our resources. I guarantee that most people wash their clothes more often than they need to, and that most people own more clothes than they need. Countering the cultural norms that push us to over-sanitize and over-consume is part of what needs to happen for a healthier future. Buying less and buying more sustainable textiles must go together. We always must examine how the industry can meet the global demand as if everyone had the same standard of living. It is unfair to assume that consumption should stop at places that are able to consume now and not include future consumers. It is in that light that we have to weigh the benefits and cost of each type of textile. Linen may be more sustainable than synthetic alternatives and cotton, but can it meet global demand without causing significantly more harm through land use changes and scaled up industrial processes? Like the food industry, we have to sometimes confront our biases or the presumptions attached to some consumer habits. Organic food, for example, is not better for the environment because if everyone ate organic food, the additional land and resources required would outweigh the cost of more intensive agriculture. For textile and food and most other things in high consumption societies, we face an unpleasant choice. We can drastically change our consumer habits and above all reduce how much we consume, or we can continue as is, prioritize the most efficient production methods, and hope the balance of our ecosystem will continue to produce bearable climatic conditions that can be mitigated with technology. That means, in the case of textile, that if we are to continue consuming at the levels we have been, synthetic fibers are the most sustainable option. It is efficient and affordable, has relatively low emissions that can be further reduced, and has low land use impact. The cost, without astounding technological breakthroughs, is an increased incursion of plastic pollution in every part of our environment and biology. The only way to truly make cleaner textiles the dominant textiles, again, really, without paying the high cost of further environmental destruction through land use conversion, is if we drastically reduce how much we buy, enough that the reduction is as great or greater than the increasing need that comes from the addition of more consumers through economic and population growth. If you're like me, you may be shaking your head, thinking that's never going to happen. And I agree. It is absolutely unfair to expect us, as a collective consumer, facing widely disparate living conditions, hardships, and educational backgrounds, to make that choice. The share of people who is receptive to this message, able and willing to make changes, is minuscule. It is unlikely that the cleaner textile will ever be cheaper than the dirtiest ones. The choice must be resolved through forceful but thoughtful government policy. How we make this happen is, I think, the challenge of our age. Yet, individual choice is not meaningless. I believe there are many people, a few influencers would be great, who are willing to make that changes that can have lasting repercussions by showing an alternative to our current mode of consumption. I hope what follows is helpful in making decisions. I'll focus on textiles that represent a significant share of global fiber production and use the following criteria to evaluate each textile. The first one is environmental impact, based on a full product cycle from production to disposal. The second is scale and versatility. This plays an important part for creating viable alternatives that are affordable to most. Scale is also critical to contextualizing environmental impact. Ideally, textile producers would prioritize fibers that have the lowest impact so that at scale, the impact is minimized. This also means that fibers that are higher impact but serve a clear purpose may be sustainable if the production remains small scale. Right, and the third thing is co-benefits. Sustainability is meaningless if it does not serve to better people's lives. All right, so one last thing. For all materials, there is a great deal of variability. The impact depends on where and how textile is produced. Different certification can completely change the impact of a product. And for a deep dive into differences, I recommend looking at this very thorough tool from Textile Exchange. They show how certification can change the impact of a textile along multiple dimensions relative to the same textile produced without any standards. All right, so before I get into the weeds, here is the bottom line in order of importance. 1. Buy less, wear longer, and wash less often. 2. Buy secondhand whenever possible. 3. If you are in the upper half of the income distribution of a wealthy country, always buy certified 100% plant-based fabrics and, for specific uses, animal-based fabrics. And 4. Be strategic about customizing your wardrobe. Dyeing is among the most harmful parts of producing textiles. Look for undyed or naturally dyed fabrics and integrate colors through accessories that use less harmful processing. Let's begin with the largest source of fiber, synthetics. Synthetics represent 65% of the global production of fiber, with polyester accounting for most of that at 54%. Synthetics also include nylon and acrylic. I'm not going to break down their impact by type because they all share similar issues. Synthetics illustrate why it is so important to be careful how we discuss sustainability. In some ways, and some have made the argument, synthetics are the most sustainable fiber. As I mentioned earlier, the greenhouse gas emissions per pound are relatively low, almost as low as plant-based fibers. Synthetics require little land. They are extremely cheap and versatile. In short, there is a good reason they are the most common fiber. And yet, they are the least sustainable option. Not only that, synthetics can never be sustainable unless some truly remarkable technology emerges for recycling. To understand why synthetics can never be sustainable, we can first look at emissions. Synthetics are mass-produced in factories that have highly concentrated emissions. Manufacturers have made strides in reducing their emissions, but they have not eliminated them, far from it. And plastic producers are still among the most toxic factories in the world. More importantly, they are directly and inextricably tied to fossil fuel extraction. All other fibers can thrive without fossil fuels. Synthetics are fossil fuel. This means that their impact on health is not only measurably more direct, but unavoidable. Because synthetics are part of the fossil fuel industry, they have no incentives to transition to alternatives. In fact, the growth of synthetics is one of the strategies the fossil fuel industry has relied on to keep demand up. They have been highly successful, displacing plant-based fibers over time. The mode of production, large-scale, highly industrialized, means that a few firms control the market and can use exploitative labor practices with few opportunities for standards. When was the last time you came across a fair trade polyester? It just doesn't exist. Plastic production has been a boon for many countries, especially in East and Southeast Asia, but we have to ask, at what cost? The problem with synthetics is not only where they come from, but also where they end up. Recycling synthetics is difficult and energy intensive. Disposal is by far the most common outcome and results in more plastic pollution. Research shows that textiles are the leading source of microplastics, in fact. We know very little about microplastics other than they are everywhere. Our biology and ecosystem have become intermingled with plastic. It could be fine. Maybe the concentration of plastic is not high enough to harm us. We just don't know. The fact is that plastic pollution is so recent and has accelerated so rapidly that we will not know the consequences before our environment is so saturated that it will probably no longer matter because the consequences of pollution will be all too obvious, or we will have found a solution to remove or stem the spread of plastic pollution. In cases like that, where we don't really have enough information to make a decision, I follow an agnostic logic. If plastic pollution does not ultimately harm us, does it make me worse off today to forego sources of plastic pollution as much as possible, just in case it makes a huge difference down the line? For anyone who lives comfortably, the answer is that it will not harm you to forego synthetic clothing as much as possible and the benefits could be substantial. In short, synthetics should not be the most common source of fiber. It just does not fit with our vision for the future. Importantly, until quite recently, no one wore synthetics, ever. They are not a necessity. In the short term, there is a place for them to fulfill certain needs for extremely affordable clothing and large-scale production without using much land. In other words, synthetics will be part of the mix of fibers for the foreseeable future. But it should not be replacing plant-based fibers for most people, and their share should be decreasing rapidly over time, not increasing. Plant-based fibers is the next largest category. It accounts for a little over a quarter of all textile production, with cotton being the dominant source. Plant-based textiles are generally the most sustainable because plants produce low emissions and are highly productive. Cultivation is in many cases highly adaptable and economically beneficial, and processing can be low impact. Plant-based textiles are also versatile and can be used to make most things we need textiles for. How the textile is produced matters more than the material the fiber is made of. The difference in impact between a garment made of cotton and linen is not as great as the difference between cotton with no standards and cotton produced under the strictest holistic standards. For all plant-based fibers, looking for trusted certification is important and is the best way to buy lower impact textiles with the greatest socioeconomic benefits. This puts all textiles at a higher price point, which is only partially offset by buying less often. Despite this limitation, a plurality, if not majority of people who live in countries that have contributed the most to climate change can afford to buy the certified version of textiles when they need it. Let's look at cotton a little bit more closely. Cotton is an input-intensive crop, using a lot of water, pesticides, and other things to make it grow. Processing is also input-intensive. But before pointing the finger at cotton as the worst, it is important to keep in mind that all fibers can lose any positive aspect at the production and processing stages. Industrial scale production, dyeing, mixing with synthetics, and other forms of processing applies to all fibers. Cotton can be grown in a much wider geographic range than hemp and flax in terms of latitudes. As such, its impact can be more widespread in that it supports important economic growth in many countries that have contributed virtually nothing to the global economic crisis and desperately need the resources to invest in their uncertain future. Cotton is widely available and has reached scale, but production has decreased due to the competition from synthetics, as I mentioned. Cotton is not among the most durable textiles, but its versatility means that it is used for most textile uses. The lower durability means that it is not ideal for clothing that gets washed most often, and mixed plant fibers may be a better option for things like underwear. Because cotton has reached scale, it is highly affordable, but as noted, conventional cotton has an environmental cost, and buying certified cotton makes a significant difference. All other plant-based fibers are marginal in the global production system. The next largest sources are flax, which is what is used for linen, and hemp, which together account for 0.7% of global production. Linen and hemp are often used as examples of more sustainable fibers because the worst forms of flax and hemp production are better for the environment than the worst forms of cotton production. But some of this status is due to their small scale. If hemp and flax were to be scaled up to account for a sizable share of the global fiber production, there's a very real risk that they would go the way of unregulated cotton and lose their status as a more sustainable option. Unfortunately, there are some obstacles to scaling up flax and hemp production. The marginal status of the fiber means the market is small and production has not benefited from the kind of innovations that would make cultivation and processing more efficient, less impactful, and cheaper. The plants grow easily, but in a moderate climate, something that could lead to a shrinking or expansion of available land for cultivation depending on how the climate changes. While there are some risks and obstacles associated with scaling up flax and hemp cultivation, the potential benefits are also very real. Linen and hemp fibers are more durable than cotton. The plants they come from are versatile, easy to grow, with much less water and other inputs. The plants have properties that can help with soil remediation, bolstering biodiversity, and creating economic opportunities. This last point is important. The climate for growing hemp and linen means that production happens mostly in affluent countries with advanced agricultural systems. In most of these countries, opportunities to diversify are important for independent, smaller-scale farmers, and crops like these provide an important alternative to subsidized crops, which tend to go to animal feed. While the economic benefits are unlikely to go to the countries who need it the most, this is still an area that can lead to significant benefits in a sector that has struggled and mostly gone backwards in terms of sustainability. Other natural plant-based textiles like rami have the potential to diversify the plant-based sourcing of fibers further, but production has been so niche that there is generally too little research on them to establish their impact or potential for expansion. The next category is man-made cellulose fibers. Those fibers are usually produced from trees or other fibrous plants like bamboo or even pineapple. The most common of these products is viscose, which accounts for about 5% of all fiber production. The impact of these types of products varies quite a bit. Viscose, for example, is considered a high-impact fiber because the processing is very energy-intensive and input-intensive, creating toxic byproducts that make it more like a synthetic fiber than a plant-based fiber. Lyocell has been lauded as a more sustainable alternative, but it accounts for only about 0.3% of global fiber production. Lyocell is derived from wood pulp, meaning that it must be sourced from sustainable forest operations to maintain its benefits. Forests, despite their appeal for carbon sequestration, have limitations when managed like large-scale monocultures, making it an issue for lyocell. In addition, the complex process to obtain lyocell also means that it is relatively expensive and may struggle to compete with other textiles without a market shift. In short, lyocell is a serious scaling issue. And personally, I don't see the appeal of any of the man-made cellulose fibers other than for niche uses. They have too few benefits over plant-based fibers, and the complexity of the production process multiplies the opportunities for abuse. Last but not least, let's look at animal-based fibers. Animal-based fibers have attracted a lot of attention in the sustainability debate, with some calling it a good option and others saying it is the absolute worst. Wool is by far the most common animal-based fiber, accounting for 1% of global fiber production. Right, I want you to let that sink for a moment. Wool accounts for 1% of global textile production. Why it accounts for such a small share is the most important thing in assessing the sustainability of animal-based fibers. And as an aside, wool being our core source material at Bunnymuff, it will get its own video forthcoming. All right, let's establish something right away. Wool has the greatest environmental impact as measured by greenhouse gas emissions per unit. Despite accounting for 1% of all fiber, sheep are responsible for between half as much to 5.5 times as much greenhouse gas emissions than polyester textiles. The wide range is a problem with using only emissions to guide the sustainable practices. Estimating emissions is difficult, and estimates often vary a lot between sources. Still, there is no denying that emissions from sheep are large and impactful because sheep emit a lot of potent methane. Detractors of wool often stop there. Yet, the claim that wool is sustainable is not unfounded. First, the figure is distorted because sheep are multi-purpose and are raised primarily for their meat, not wool. So the total emissions for sheep look enormous, but a large share of sheep are never used for wool, therefore skewing the numbers. The reason wool is controversial is because as the industry exists, it cannot be sustained without meat. Wool can be sustainable when it is the primary product sheep are raised for and when it comes from smaller scale certified farms. The same applies to animal welfare. Anti-wool advocates are quick to point to industrial-scale sheep farming, but omit the fact that most sheep are raised at small scale. Like cotton and other fibers, how wool is produced makes a great deal of difference. There is a crucial difference between wool and the other fibers we have looked at, and it all comes back to the 1% figure. Unlike the other fibers where there are ample opportunities for expansion, wool is already at scale. All the wool produced today is enough to make sweaters for everyone on Earth every single year. Now, most people live in areas where you don't need a wool sweater, and no one needs a new sweater every single year. Wool can be used for more than sweaters, of course, but it is a niche textile nonetheless. Some firms have created wool underwear and other products to diversify, but those products are not competitive and they are unnecessary. Wool is best used for articles that are long-lasting, like coats, suits, and sweaters. In short, we already produce more wool than is needed to meet the global product for wool products, including the bulk of wool that is used for interior fiber like rugs. If sheep and lamb meat consumption decrease to the required levels for a sustainable future, and that's about 10% of current consumption levels, the number of sheep could decrease by hundreds of millions and still meet the global demand for wool. At that point, sheep's already small contribution to global emissions would become truly negligible. So while emissions from sheep per unit are large, the impact of wool in later stage is far more benign. Wool requires little care. Its antimicrobial properties mean that you can wear wool garments many, many times without washing it. Once a pure wool product has reached the end of its life, it can be easily recycled for various uses or thrown into the garden where it will decompose nicely. So yes, wool is a high-impact fiber, but in the grand scheme of things, avoiding wool is never going to be what tips the balance between a sustainable and unsustainable wardrobe. In addition, while much wool comes from industrial sources, notably Australia, over half of all wool comes from countries that have little to no large-scale production. As such, wool is an important source of economic sustainability for small-scale farms. Sheep farming is very diverse both in where it takes place, but also how it is done. Sheep have been used to manage vegetation on solar farms, for example, and in forests, where they can mitigate the risk of fires. There's also active research into methods that reduce methane emissions, meaning that unlike synthetics, emissions could be meaningfully curbed. So, to answer the second big question at the top, we need to answer another question. Can wool fiber survive without meat as a primary product? I think it can, for niche, high-quality clothing produced ethically and sustainably at a small scale, and will last a lifetime, if not generations.